Good morning. I'm glad to see you all here. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, worship team. If you came in a little bit late and you're wondering what happened to the meet and greet time, we did that earlier in the service, so there's a little incentive if you want to catch up with people to come a little bit earlier. My name is Kevin Clark. If I haven't met you, I'm the senior pastor here at Encompass Church, and this is actually the second week of our Christmas celebration, and so you've heard some of the things that are happening as the month goes on. I hope you'll make time to join us in those. We are also in the middle of a season of service, and for the past several months, we've encouraged you by offering different ways you can serve our local community. And we've done things all over the area, and we thank you for the participation and for the willingness to sacrifice to make some of these things happen. This is week 2 of 3 weeks in our Christmas giving tree cycle, and so we've selected 2 elementary schools in the Elizabeth School District where there are families who are challenged financially, and so we have a couple of trees out in the lobby, and on those trees last week were gift cards from kids who might not receive gifts because their families don't have the resources. And some of you, actually all those cards went away, got taken by you. Please bring those back by next Sunday. Bring the gifts unwrapped. We have a wrapping team. We want to make sure we have the right things. And so bring the tags with the gifts so we know who the gift was intended for. We also had some cards out there that were gift card requests from parents of those families. And there are more of those on the trees out there today. So if you didn't have the opportunity to pick one up, if you would like to do that, just make sure you bring the tags and the gift cards that you purchase back with you next week. You can purchase larger ones than they've asked for if you'd like. That was just the suggestion that we were making to help these particular families that we know about. And we also want to remind you, we're continuing on with our school food drive. You've heard that some of those families are food challenged, and so we are continuing to solicit food donations. And in your program, you'll find a QR code that will take you right to a wish list. You can order it from there, have it delivered to the church if you'd prefer, or you can pick up those items yourself and bring them to the church. And that's an ongoing thing that we're going to continue. So last week was a little bleak in that area, so if you're feeling generous this week and you can help us with that, that would be great. J. Edgar Park was born in Ireland in 1879, and as a young man, he decided he wanted to study theology. He went to school in England, then he came to the U.S. and went to Princeton, and he was hired as the pastor of a church in Massachusetts, where he served for 18 years. And then he was invited to be the president of Wheaton College in Illinois, where he served out the rest of his career. Park is actually fairly well known for some hymns that he wrote, and for many books on the Christian faith that he also wrote. But he's probably best known for a very short story called The Man Who Missed Christmas. And it goes like this. It was Christmas Eve, and as usual, George Mason was the last to leave the office. He walked over to a massive safe, spun the dials, and swung the heavy door open. Making sure it would not close behind him, he stepped inside, and he noticed a square of white cardboard taped just above the top row of safety deposit boxes. On the card, a few words were written, and it took George's mind back to the year before. Exactly 1 year before, he had entered the same vault, and then behind his back, slowly and noiselessly, the door had closed. He was trapped and entombed in the sudden and terrifying dark. He hurled himself at the unyielding door, and his hoarse cry sounded like an explosion in the room. Through his mind flashed all the stories he had heard of men found suffocated in bank vaults. No clock controlled this safe's mechanism. It would remain locked until it was opened from the outside tomorrow morning. Then realization hit him. No one would come tomorrow because tomorrow was Christmas Day. Once more, he flung himself at the door, shouting wildly until he sank to his knees exhausted, and silence came, a high-pitched singing silence that seemed deafening. He had more than 36 hours to wait before anyone came. 36 hours in a steel box 3 feet wide, 8 feet long, and 7 feet high. Would his oxygen last? Perspiring and breathing heavily, he felt his way around the floor, and in the far right-hand corner, just above the floor, he found a small circular opening. He thrust his finger into it and felt, faint but unmistakable, a cool current of air. The tension release was so sudden that he burst into tears. After a time, he sat up. Surely he would not have to stay trapped for the full 36 hours, would he? Somebody would miss him. But then he thought, who? He was unmarried and he lived alone. The maid who cleaned his apartment was just a servant, and he had always treated her as such. He had been invited to spend Christmas Eve with his brother's family, but the children got on his nerves and always expected presents. A friend had asked him to go to a home for elderly people on Christmas Day and play the piano because he was a great musician, but he had made an excuse. He had intended to sit at home alone, listening to some new music he had purchased for himself for Christmas. He dug his nails into his palms until the pain balanced his misery. Nobody was coming to let him out. If you have a Bible, turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 2. Today is not only week 2 of our Christmas celebration, but also week 2 in a 3-week series that we are calling Missing Christmas. The real Christmas story found in the Bible in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke tell us about 3 people who missed or nearly missed the purpose of Christmas. The reasons that they missed or nearly missed it are often reasons that we actually miss Christmas. Reasons like distraction or defiance or disappointment. Last week, we talked about a person who missed Christmas, most likely because he or she, we don't know exactly whether this person was a man or a woman, was distracted by daily life, by the activities of being an innkeeper in Bethlehem. Today, we're going to talk about a person in the first Christmas story who missed Christmas because of his defiance. How can we avoid missing Christmas like he did? Look at Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.'" Now, most of us are pretty familiar, I would imagine, with the story of the wise men or the magi, to use the word that the Gospel of Matthew uses for those men. Sometime after Jesus was born, a group of them, Matthew tells us, came from the east looking for the new king of the Jews. And they were following a new star, a mysterious star that seemed to move, that led them to the place where that new king had been born. And contrary to certain traditions, we don't know how many wise men there were. We don't know their names. And we don't know with certainty where they called home. Now, several theories exist about their origins. Some are more plausible than the others. One theory says that each of the wise men, and it assumes there were 3 because there were 3 gifts, was actually a king from a different nation in the east. But there's no biblical evidence or even extra biblical evidence to support that conjecture. Some think that they may have been Persian from a city like the city of Susa, which was an 1,000-mile journey by foot or by camel or by donkey from or to Jerusalem. And the reason people think they might have been Persian from Susa or someplace like that is the Greek word that Matthew uses that we pronounce magi, and actually in Greek it's pronounced magoi, is a word that references a Persian priestly class of scholars who studied both religion and astrology. The Old Testament book of Daniel refers to wise men from the city of Babylon. This is the place where the Israelites were taken in captivity because of their centuries-long defiance toward God and his law. It was at least 700 miles by foot from Babylon to Jerusalem. And so wherever these men came from, they came a very great distance, and they were undoubtedly people of prominence and influence and wealth. Whoever they were, they had learned or been told the prophecies from the Jews, specifically prophecies about a Messiah. And they were watching for signs that prophecy, those individual prophecies, were being fulfilled. They saw a star rise, which they understood to mark the fact that the promised Messiah had been born. And so they made a journey following the star with the intention of worshiping him, of showing him respect and honor for who he was. And when they arrived in Jerusalem, which seemed the logical place for them to go, given where the star was, they began to ask questions of people they thought would know the answers. So look at chapter 2, look at verses 3 through 6. It says, when Herod the king heard this, that they had come to see the new king of the Jews, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. In Bethlehem, they told him in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So when the wise men arrived from the east and began asking questions about where the new king was, Scripture tells us that Herod was troubled. And when Herod was troubled, everyone was troubled. Why was Herod troubled? Herod, how many times did I say Harold? This could be an interesting sermon. Herod was the ruler of what we now today call Israel and some additional territory as well. But he was not a legitimate Jewish king. He was actually an Edomite. His people were descended from Esau, not Jacob. And he was widely regarded by faithful Jews to be an imposter king. He was actually elected king over Israel by the Roman Senate, but he had to take his reign somewhat by force. There were people killed as he came into power. And he was also known as a very cruel tyrant. And so faithful Jews despised Herod and all he stood for. And because they did, he feared rebellion. And to stay in power, Herod had a practice of executing anyone who posed a threat. And so we know from historical records that he executed thousands of citizens during his reign. Among them were several prominent Jewish rabbis, two of his own brothers-in-law, one of his wives, her mother, and two of his sons. It was so deadly to be a part of Herod's family that Caesar Augustus himself once said in his throne room, I would rather be Herod's pig than his son. On his deathbed, Herod ordered his army to round up as many prominent Jews as they could find and imprison them. And he instructed them that when he died, they were to execute all of those prisoners. He said, the reason why is I don't think anyone will mourn me, so I'll give them a reason to mourn. Fortunately, his own sister canceled that order immediately after his death. So Herod was a paranoid, murderous, evil individual. And when the Magi asked, where is this new king of the Jews? He was troubled because he saw an immediate potential threat to his power. And not knowing the answer to the Magi's question, he rounded up the Jewish religious leaders and asked them where this Messiah would be. They quoted the book of Micah, chapter 5, verse 2, which tells us that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem in the land of Judah. Now, Herod could have marched there that day. He could have executed every single person in Bethlehem on that day, but he was clever and he was very eager to avoid an insurrection. So look at Matthew chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. It says, then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. So after the Jewish scholars told Herod the Messiah would come from Bethlehem, he called the wise men back to himself secretly, it says. And he asked them when the star had first appeared. And he did so intentionally to determine how old of a child he would need to be looking for when he went to see him. And the wise men's account of the appearance of the star told him that this child would be less than 2 years old. So he said to the Magi, "Go find him. When you do, come back and tell me where he is so I can go and worship him too." Now you and I know, and everyone shortly after this period of time was soon to learn, that Herod had no intention of worshiping Jesus. He was lying and he planned to kill him, but he wanted to do it quietly because the people of this day, as I shared with you last week, had an anticipatory sense of the arrival of the Messiah, and they believed he would arrive in Herod's lifetime. And so for him to go after this Messiah and openly kill him invited rebellion at the hands of the people he was supposed to be leading. So he lied. But the truth was almost immediately revealed. What does that tell us about Christmas? It tells us that Christmas exposes the darkness in our plans, in mankind's plans, in my individual plans, in your individual plans. Would Herod have said, if you asked him, "My plans are dark and evil"? Probably not any more than you and I would ever say that if we were confronted with a plan that we had made which was sinful and selfish. If confronted, he would likely have said, "It's critically important that I stay in control. Rome chose me. And because Rome chose me, I am the best person to decide the future of my kingdom. I must eliminate any threats to the future I envision. And if a few people get hurt along the way, that is too bad. And if there is a God, I'm sure he agrees with me." Don't we sometimes say the same thing about our own plans? It's important that I stay in control of my life. God chose me. I'm the best person to decide the future of my kingdom, and I must eliminate threats to that future. And if a few people get hurt along the way, that's too bad. I believe in a God, and I believe he agrees. When Janet and I lived in San Diego, one of our neighbors used to wander frequently down to our house to chat. Some of you have heard me tell this story in the past, but it fit this text really well. He was a relatively new Christian, and he was eager to talk about what God was doing in his life. And so one November, we're hanging out in the garage, and I'm chatting with this guy, and I actually just offhandedly said to him, "Do you have any plans for Thanksgiving?" And he said, "No, my sister lives in Los Angeles. It's less than 90 miles, but we never go up there." And since I'm a nosy pastor, I said, "Why not?" And so then he told me that more than 15 years earlier, his sister had invited his family to LA for Thanksgiving. And because his kids were very young at that time, and he and his wife kept them on a fairly regular schedule of times when they ate and slept and things like that, he had said to his sister, "We prefer to eat early rather than late so we can drive home in time to get our kids in bed at the usual hour." And so that Thanksgiving day, when he and his family arrived early at the agreed upon time, he said his sister said to him, "The turkey is not yet in the oven. We will have to wait another 3 or 4 hours." And he was so angry, he loaded his family back in the car and they drove home. And they have never spoken to each other since that day. And he ended by insisting with great enthusiasm, "We agreed on a plan, and I had every right to be angry." And when he finished, I did the pastor thing, and I smiled. And I said, that's true. You had that right. And someday she'll die. And when you're sitting at her funeral, will you still be glad that you stuck to your plan? And there was a very, very long pause. And then he smiled and said, maybe I'll call her. Christmas, the arrival of Jesus, exposed the sinful and selfish plans of Herod. And it is actually meant to do the same for you and me. Instead of in defiance, clinging to the plans that we have for our lives, not just our holiday experiences, but our whole lives, we are meant to rejoice that a far better plan has come into reality. Next week, we're going to talk about Joseph, the man who served as Jesus' earthly father when Jesus was growing up, though he was not Jesus' biological father. And when Joseph learned that Mary was pregnant with Jesus and he knew that he could not be the father, Scripture tells us he resolved to divorce her. Matthew chapter 1, verses 20 and 21 says this about Joseph. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. So an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Mary's child, whom you shall call Jesus, will save his people from their sins. That was the better plan that Christmas put into place, that Christmas initiated. A plan that rescues us from our own sinful, selfish plans for our own kingdom and saves us from them. Not only does Christmas expose the darkness that's in our plans, the secret lining of getting what we want, but Christmas actually initiated a full-scale war against our sin. Not sin just in general, but your personal sin, my personal sin, the stuff you've been wallowing in all week. Christmas initiated a full-scale war against that sin. The first Christmas was not a story with wrapped presents and beautifully decorated trees surrounded by extended family and followed by delicious banquets. It's a story of God's first attack in an all-out, full-scale war on sin. Every single one of us is born with and cannot escape a sin nature. It is wired into us. And we regularly, and by regularly, I'm saying weekly, daily, hourly, there's not a word minutely, but minutely, desire, plan, do and say things that God would look at us and say, that is evil. That is sin. And sin is like a virus. It infects us in every part of our behavior, our motives. Nothing we think or do is free and clear of the impact of sin, not entirely. And it's not a minor ailment like a common cold. We can't keep it walled up in some secret compartment of our lives that we don't show on Sunday morning. It's in all parts of us. It cannot be treated with education or with counseling or with medication or with better parenting or with good intentions. The only way to beat sin is through Jesus Christ. And without him, you and I are going to lose that war. And Satan knows that. And so Herod's plan was Satan's first counterattack against God's war on sin. And we can say with all seriousness that when Jesus was born, all hell broke loose. Then he saved us. Satan was and is today trying to do everything to prevent that from happening, trying to do everything to keep you stuck in sin. And it's actually seasons like this where that stuff materializes sometimes out of the blue. We just don't expect it, and we have such high expectations for such good things that suddenly we get blindsided by someone else or ourselves wallowing in our sin. No one can beat sin by his or her own willpower because no one has ever been able to live a sinful life. No one, that is, except Jesus himself. That baby, the Son of God, the King that the wise men came to see and came to worship, came to bring us hope. He didn't stay a baby. He grew up and he lived the sinless, righteous life that we would have to live in order to have a relationship with the God of heaven. And then he offered his perfect life on a cross to pay on our behalf the rightful penalty for your sin and my sin. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21 says, "For our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." This is a very cryptic sounding verse, so it helps to actually put names in place of the pronouns and say, for our sake, God the Father made Jesus to be sin who knew no sin, so that in Jesus we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus, who never sinned, took our sin upon himself, and Scripture describes that as him becoming our sin. He died for us because our sin that he became deserves death and separation from God. And if we receive that sacrifice of himself in our place and believe in faith that that and that alone saves us from our sin, Scripture teaches us plainly and clearly that God exchanges our sin for his righteousness. The real purpose of Christmas is not, in spite of the movies, recovering a childhood sense of lost wonder. It's not looking for the perfect gift to give to the perfect person at the perfect moment. And it's not even creating and maintaining peace around the dinner table, which for a lot of us is a very elusive thing that only might happen on holidays. The real purpose of Christmas is the proclamation in and through us, each one of us, of the arrival of the only one that can offer us the right way to God. In doing so, Christmas forces us to come to grips with the fact that you and I are no longer in charge of our lives. Not only does Christmas expose the darkness in our plans and initiate a full-scale war against our sin, but Christmas demands that we worship someone else other than ourselves. Christmas announces that if we want what the new child king offered, that we don't get it with superficial adherence to a set of beliefs. You and I don't get to be in charge anymore. Look at Matthew chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. It says, "After listening to the king, the wise men went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. The wise men left Herod and they followed the star to Bethlehem. And it stopped over the place where Jesus was. And when they saw it, it says they were overjoyed. They went inside, they saw the child, they bowed down, and they worshiped. And the terminology that's actually used doesn't match the nativity scenes that you and I see. We see, usually what I think I see is I see a king in the back with one gift, and then I see two on one knee, each with one gift. This is a term that's fall on your face flat type of worship. Men of prominence and wealth and extraordinary influence fell on their faces in front of the child. And they were not saying, glad to make your acquaintance, glad you're part of our elite club of power brokers who each control our own lives and our own kingdom. They were saying, now I serve you. My kingdom, my life is yours. Do with it as you will. And everyone who wants to truly experience Christmas, even this year, must choose to respond like them. The Magi were outsiders. They were not Jews, and most of us are not Jews. And they probably were worshipers of other gods. The Messiah wasn't promised directly to their people, yet God chose them. He gave them knowledge of these prophecies to prompt the curiosity that would begin to make them seek out the answers to these mysterious pronouncements. And then he showed them a star, a sign that they, as astrologers, as students of the sky and of prophecy, would recognize as something different and something worthy of pursuing, that probably would point them to this promised king that they had heard about and people had been told was coming for centuries. And when they came face to face with the Son, they realized that all that had happened was a call to worship someone else, not their gods, and not themselves and their plans for their lives, but instead the only one worthy of worship. And they responded with joy, with gifts, and by falling on their faces before the King. And every one of us who truly wants to experience that elusive Christmas experience must come to the King the way that they did. If you consider the story carefully, you actually realize that even Herod was given the opportunity to worship Jesus. The wise men came to him first. Why didn't they go straight to Bethlehem? Well, they thought certainly the king of this nation, or this new baby who's going to be the King of Kings, would be the one who would tell us this wonderful news and where to find him. And so they went to him with a story that he was not expecting. And when they came, he called the religious leaders, and they told him the prophecies that he apparently did not know or did not remember. He had the opportunity to respond well in that moment, but like too many of us, he chose defiance. He chose to make everything about him. And he refused to stop worshiping himself and his plans. He rejected Jesus, and Satan said, ding, this is an opportunity, and I will use this pridefulness to benefit me. Herod hoped to kill Jesus, the new king of the Jews. He told the Magi that when they found the baby, that they should come back and tell him so he could go and worship the baby too. But God had a far better plan. Look at Matthew chapter 2, verses 12 to 15. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he, Joseph, rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken centuries before by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. After the wise men left Joseph and Mary and Jesus and went home by another way so they could avoid Herod, an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream, and he said, get up and leave, go to Egypt. And Joseph obeyed, and taking the valuable gifts which God had provided from those faraway strangers, they went to a distant land, and they stayed there until they were told it was time to come back. God intervened in Herod's and Satan's defiant plans to carry out their kingdom the way that they wanted to carry out their kingdom, to kill Jesus. And instead, God carried out his own divine plan. one that had been prophesied centuries before, one in which God wins. But Satan and Herod were not finished trying to win. When Herod saw that the wise men had eluded him, he ordered his men to kill all the boys under the age of 2 in Bethlehem. It was a horrific, ultimate act of defiance against the God of the universe, and it produced a terrible result. And yet it did not stop Christmas. The arrival of Jesus brought hope to our world that still exists today. Not only does Christmas expose darkness in our plans, not only does it initiate an all-out war against our own personal sin, not only does it demand that we worship someone other than ourselves, but Christmas declares that God's plans can't be defeated. Although Satan may win some skirmishes in our world, in our neighborhood, even in us, in the end, the war against sin and death has already been won. In J. Edgar Park's story called The Man Who Missed Christmas, George Mason locks himself in a safe on Christmas Eve and everyone else has gone home for the holiday, and he realizes no one's coming back for 36 hours. It says, miserably, the whole of Christmas Day went by and the succeeding night. And on the morning after Christmas, the head clerk came into the office at the usual time, opened the safe, and then went on into his private office. No one saw George Mason stagger out into the corridor, run to the water cool, and drink gallons of water. No one paid any attention to him as he left and took a taxi home. He shaved, changed his clothes, ate breakfast, and returned to his office where all of his employees, as usual, greeted him casually. That day he met several acquaintances and talked to his own brother. Grimly, the truth closed in on George Mason. He had vanished from human society during the great festival of brotherhood, and no one had missed him at all. Reluctantly, George began to think about the true meaning of Christmas. Was it possible that he had been blind all these years with selfishness, indifference, and pride? Was not giving, after all, the essence of Christmas because it marked the time God gave his Son to the world? All through the year that followed, with little hesitant deeds of kindness, with small unnoticed acts of unselfishness, George Mason tried to prepare himself. Now, once more, it was Christmas Eve. Slowly, he backed out of the safe and he closed it. He touched its grim face lightly, almost affectionately, and then left the office. He walked out in his overcoat and hat, the same George Mason as a year ago. Or was he? He flagged down a taxi, anxious not to be late. His nephews were expecting him to help put up the tree. Afterward, he was taking his brother and sister-in-law to a Christmas play. Why was he happy? Why did the jostling against others, laden as he was with bundles that night, exhilarate and delight him? Perhaps the card that had been posted inside the safe that he had written had something to do with it. On it, he had written, "To love people, to be indispensable somewhere. That is the purpose of life and the secret of happiness." Now, the fictional story of George Mason actually was read worldwide. Some of you have probably heard that story before. And it doesn't end with the complete true ending. Yes, it is absolutely true that it is indispensable to love people and that there is a purpose of life in loving people, a purpose of life. But the ultimate purpose of life, which makes it possible to love people even at Christmas time, is to seek out and follow the one who changes our hearts and makes love happen. We can only do that the way we are called to do it, by the power of the King who was a baby when the wise men came, who rules in our lives and can rule in our plans. Don't miss Christmas this year. Don't be a Herod. Don't defiantly insist that it be about getting what you want the way that you want. Don't demand that you be the one who rules your kingdom. God is more than likely got a different plan than you have for your Christmas season. And if you trust him, you will discover that it is actually a better plan. So look for ways every day in this season to remind yourself that Christmas is about following and serving the one who came. In his famous book called Mere Christianity, author C.S. Lewis wrote this. He said, "Give up yourself and you will find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death, death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and the death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being, and you will find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will be really yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him. And with him, everything else will be thrown in."